All right, you guys, how was everything?
Can't you tell? I hated it.
You are my dad.
You're my dad.
Woogie, woogie, woogie.
Okay, I had nothing to do with the bumper, just to let you know. So that was, so we started this series a couple of weeks ago, going to the book of Romans, and we're calling it My Summer in Rome. And if you've never been to Rome, that's okay, because Paul is writing this. He had never been to Rome at this time, but he's trying to help them understand who God is and how this works in your life. And honestly, what makes Romans so amazing is Romans is different than so many of the other books that Paul writes or Peter writes in the New Testament, because he knows a lot of times he's talking to a Jewish audience that is now following Jesus Christ. Paul doesn't look at it that way. He pretty much goes after our world, who we are, and it tries to explain a lot of things, and he does a really good job of doing it. And so even though this is called Best Kind of Change, I also put the first little line in there was, this is a parent's guide. If you look at what he says about Romans, so much of what Paul is talking about is who God is, how God does things, God's own plans, his patterns. And if you are a dad, or you're a mom, or you're a grandparent, or someone who watches after other people, and you're trying to guide them along, this is an incredible study through Romans of how God does it, his plan. Because let's be honest, if you believe there's a God, even if you're not sure that there's a personal God, then think about it. If he designed it, he figured it out, don't you think he would probably have the best plan possible, right? Best plan possible about how to raise human beings, his children, try to draw them to himself. Don't you think that would work? Sure. I mean, it makes perfect sense to understand it that way. And I think as you look at it, and we look at this, you can see why it was so easy for me, as we're going into the second chapter of Romans, to make this turn and to talk about God as far as how he parents. And so I'm going to go through some things pretty fast for you, because I'm going to cover a lot this morning. But basically, I'm going to tell you, here's some steps or some things that you see about God as far as his idea of parenting, or how he moves us along. And just to start out with, here's his first point of being a good father, being a good parent, being a good someone who cares. You must show up, right? I mean, that's the first step. You have to show up. I did this with my kids when they went to school. The best way to go to do well in school is when there's class, and the professor, the teacher has a class. The first rule is what? Show up. You got to be there. In fact, I would tell my kids all the time. I know that there are people, and I have friends that tell me, oh, I can do it without going. Okay, fine. You just make it harder, though. Because if you show up, you hear what the teacher thinks is important, what matters to the teacher, which more than likely, that's what's going to be on your test. More than likely, that's what they want you to learn, what they want you to catch, right? Why? Because guess who shows up at the class first? The teacher shows up. The teacher shows up, because that's their influence. And so for a parent, for someone who wants to influence, wants to lead, for a teacher, the first thing you always have to do, you have to show up. If you don't show up, you have no real influence. Well, you do have an influence. It's just not a positive influence. It's a negative influence, isn't it? Because, mom or dad didn't show up. The person who said they cared didn't show up, but God shows up. And so let me take you just back quickly into the first chapter. Just a short little passage here. This is verse number 20. Look at what it says in chapter 1. It says, "For since the creation of the world, his," is talking about God, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been, say this with me, have been what? Clearly seen. That means God shows up. He shows up in the things that he does as well as who he is. And he goes on to say, being understood through what he has made, so that they are without. If you'd shown up, if you'd come and you'd listened or you'd watched, you would say, yeah, I got it. I understand it. I see that. In my Bible, which is the official one, okay, you can laugh. Okay, so this is actually my lime green Bible that's tearing up also. But I got a lime green one a long time ago because I know no guy would steal it and walk out with it in his arms. So it's just, In my Bible, right beside these verses in Romans, I'd written this a long time ago. I wrote, every morning we bump into God. That's what he's saying. Every morning you wake up, you get up, you approach your day, and the first thing you do, you may not realize it, the first thing you do is you bump into God. Because there's something about who God is, what God has done all around you. The first time you open your eyes, you're going to see things that you may think they're all about me, they're all about, us, but actually they're first all about who God himself is. And it's unavoidable. Now, just to let you know, because it's unavoidable, because it's always there, it's easy to miss it. It's easy to take it for granted. Of course it is. Because you just take it as, well, it's just, something you don't have to think about. It's always there. Sure it is. But it's always there because God himself is always there. God shows up in the things that he does and the things that he shows us. And then Paul's going to take a turn here in chapter 2. It's a kind of a strange turn, but I call this the best way to show off. If you want to show up, and most of us do, and you realize, but what am I going to show off? What am I going to show to the people that I care about? Here's the best way to show off, because this is the way that God himself shows off to us who he is. This is what it says in chapter 2. Listen to this. He says in verse 1, you may think that you can condemn such people. Now you say, what people is he talking about? So in the first chapter, remember, he finishes with talking about this pattern that mankind goes through. The pattern is to say, listen, I want to be God instead of God. And mankind decides to worship the creature, our lives, who we are, what we can do, rather than the Creator. And we walk away from God. I mean, it happens in the very first chapters of Genesis. You see exactly the same thing. It's just who mankind is. It's our sinful nature. And as the Old Testament prophets say, and the heart of man, my heart and your heart, is incredibly deceitful. It deceives us into thinking, oh, I can do this. If I just chase my heart and my desires, then I'll find the life that I'm looking for. But then he goes through this pattern of why it doesn't work out and how our lives actually prove that it doesn't work out. We become our own gods. We think we're wiser than God. We decide that we're so smart that he says we actually become fools. And then God does this. God says, okay, you want to do that? Go ahead. It's a picture that Paul says is of God's judgment, the natural judgment of God to say, hey, you want to chase your own desires? Let's see how that works out. Knowing that at some point we might wake up and say, this is not really worked out the way I thought it was going to work out. Remember when Jesus is talking about the prodigal son? So the prodigal son decides, my dad's rich. There are a lot of resources. Why can't those belong to me? Even though in Jewish life, just like in ours, it would belong to him. He would inherit it once his father passed away. But he decides, I'm not going to wait. I want it all now. And so the father, who is a picture of God, in his compassion toward his son, says, okay. And he gives him the resources. He gives him his cut, knowing that he's going to go and squander it and waste it and ruin it. And the older brother who stays is angry about it. Look at all the resources that are wasted. But what you should understand about the story is Jesus is pointing to the heart of God, how God allows this to happen. And one of the reasons is because resources are nothing to God. God creates them. He speaks them into being. The resources are nothing to God. What is important to God is the heart of people, the heart of his children. So God is trying to get to the heart, and what he does sometimes is allow us to go chase after the wrong. Have you ever done that? Haven't you done that? You say, I can do whatever I want to do, and you go after it, and you find out, hey, that didn't work out very well. Sometimes you get mad. I've done this before. Shouldn't someone have stopped me? Well, yeah, as a child. But as you become an adult, you get to do what you want to do. And it doesn't mean it's the right thing or the best thing for you, even though you may think it is, because you walk away from the heart of the Father. So the tendency, and he's talking to, someone would say, well, he's making these statements now about the Jewish religious. Maybe, but he may be also talking about anyone who is more moral and who builds rules and says, you operate under these rules, and they make the mistake, this is what he's going to say, because I am more moral or I'm more religious, therefore the judgment doesn't apply to me. Oh, yes, it does. And he's going to say why. If you want to catch it, it's a great, straightforward passage from a guy who was a former Pharisee, and now he is a follower of Jesus Christ. He says, so you think that you can condemn such people who have done this? He says, but you're just as bad. No, wait a minute. I'm not just as bad. I have more rules. I have a stronger code. I have more religiousness about my life than they do. He says, and you have no excuse. What? Because you know better. You're the one that even says this is the way it should work out. He says, when you say they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself. For you who judge others do these very same things. And we know that God, in his justice, will punish anyone who does such things. Since you judge others for doing these things, why do you think you can avoid God's judgment when you do the same things? Don't you see how, catch this. Now here, in fact, if you have a pen or a pencil, this is a verse you should underline, because he is setting himself up and he's setting them up to understand what God thinks is the best way to approach it. And you see God do this over and over again. He says, don't you see how wonderfully kind, how tolerant, and how patient God is with who? You. Now he's talking to the same people. Don't you see how kind and patient and tolerant God is with you? Because you do the same things. You can't claim that you don't. You just claim that you're better than this other group. But you do the same things. And God is tolerant, kind, and patient toward you. So this is the approach of God. You should learn from this. He says, does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your what? Let me say that again. His kindness, his patience, his compassion, the way God deals with us is intended to turn us from our sin. If that could turn me from my sin, just think how it could affect someone else that intentionally walks away even in a different way as they fall into the results of walking away from God, their sin, in their life. Listen, if they see it in my life, and this was true of Paul. Paul's religious. Man, Paul is strongly religious. Paul was so religious, he went after everyone who disagreed with him. And yet his heart turns. Something changes. And he is a totally different person. Now, listen, if you were raised in a church, if you were raised religious, and just let you know, I was raised in a Presbyterian church. I would say that I was raised more than anything else morally. My parents, absolutely, they pushed the moral aspect of it. You were supposed to do the right thing. And of course, being who I was, I always did the right thing. Okay, you can chuckle, and I notice in your chuckling, you're thinking, okay, you know me too. Yeah. Not only did I not always do the right thing, sometimes I did the right thing, but inside, was I thinking the right thing? No, I was thinking, yeah, just wait till I don't have to, right? Yeah, it's in all of us, and we all struggle with it. And the tendency of human beings is to say, but I manage it so well that I should be treated different. It's almost like grading on the curve, right? If you grade on the curve, listen, I'm in the upper group, so God should be okay with me and not okay with those in the lower group, because on the curve, I'm better. But think about it for a second. Just think about it, how deceptive that is. because we still sin. So if all of a sudden I say, well, it's not sin, it's how many or the degree or how well you manage it, that's the most important thing. Think about how that goes against who God himself is. His own justice, his own righteousness, and his compassion. Because if God let us, or the more religious people, get away with thinking that's all it takes, then there will be something wrong with God's judgment. But there's nothing wrong with God's judgment. And so this is what Paul says. Do you not understand how God beckons you, how God draws you, how a parent draws their own children? It's not with the rules, even though there are rules. There should be rules. You want to say right, wrong. It's with the love that the parent has. They show up, they're there, and then they have found that this is the way to the heart of my child, that my child knows I care about them. I was, years ago, I don't know if you remember, but called the Rodney King incident. You remember the Rodney King incident? Some of us are old enough to remember it. And so there were riots in L.A., and in L.A. there are actually times when people in the inner city actually beat up and actually killed people who had nothing to do with anything that was going on, but they just did it anyway. And I remember it was so strange, and a lot of people were just, were kind of at a loss. What does this mean? So let me tell you what my opinion, what I think this means. This means that those people who were living in the inner city, LA, believed that no one cared about them. That's what it meant. So when you believe no one cares about you, there's nothing you won't do. Why not? If I go do something wrong, so no one cares anyway. There's no compassion from anyone anyway. And even people in the inner city who are good people, and they're not wicked and evil people trying to do bad. They get caught up in it only because they're caught up in this idea, but those people out there, they don't care about us. They could care less about us. At least we'll get their attention. If you remember when you were growing up, the kid who was the bad kid in the class, right? And one of the characteristics of the bad kid in the class doesn't believe anyone cares. Nobody at home cares. No one at school cares. So a lot of times they act out in order to at least get some attention, and it's like a cry for help. Say, someone care about what I do or care about who I am. See, God understands that. And God has this incredible patience toward us. There's a verse we're going to come to in the second chapter that's going to talk about the wrath of God and the anger of God, and we had that in chapter 1. Let me help you. In fact, I still got this from a guy named Skip Hertzig, who is the pastor of Calvary Chapel in New Mexico, who does a great job with language and words, and this is what he talks about. And let me help you with this, because you really like this. There are different words in the Hebrew for wrath or for anger, and the word for like hot, fiery, I'm just mad, you said something, kind of like a person in power, and hey, don't make them mad, because you can just say the wrong thing, and man, they will unleash their anger completely unwarranted. Maybe you grew up with someone like that. Maybe it was your dad, maybe it was your mom, maybe somebody in the family. You knew, hey, don't say anything, don't make them angry, because man, their anger will be unleashed. And it's a way, that type of anger is a way to control, because you at least know that people fear you. And this, in the Hebrew, there's a word called that is thumas. And thumas is the word for that. So you think of like a thermometer or a thermal, something that shows hotness or fire. That's not the word that's used to describe God, just to let you know. He's not described that way. God is not the one that you said the wrong thing, man, you kind of ticked him off, you did something else, and he just blows up. And he just decides, let's just fry them all. Remember, there's one point where the disciples even go to Jesus. They said, hey, you want us to call down heaven and just fry them all because they're not doing what you want them to do? And Jesus goes, what are you talking about? Do you not understand? Listen, if it works that way, guess who's going to get fried? Us too, right? We forget that part also. That's not the word to describe God's anger. The word that describes his anger really comes from a word that we may get the word organic from. Orge means that it's an anger that's built up over time. And it shows patience, But the anger is there. The wrath is there, and it builds up and it builds up and it builds up until eventually it bears fruit. It has to be dealt with. That's the word that describes God's anger, because it speaks of God's patience and his compassion with us. And a lot of people mistake God's patience and compassion as God doesn't care. I've told people before, hey, you look in Genesis, and it says, Adam and Eve, he's there and says, can you not eat of the fruit? And she says, yeah, because God says, in the day that we eat the fruit, we die. He talks her, deceives her into eating the fruit. Does she die? She doesn't. Now, here's the problem. That's not what he was talking about. He was not talking about all of a sudden a lightning bolt is going to hit you and fry you. There's a death that occurs here that is lasting in our life and will have to be somehow remedied, or we will not exist with God. We will not be with God. And you may have thought that before. In fact, you may have seen people do wrong things, and you think, hey, they got away with it. No, they didn't. You know why? Because the wrong things that you do change you on the inside, and you can't fix it. You may think you can. I knew a guy, he said, he was doing things he knew he shouldn't do, but this was his reasoning. One day, I'm going to be rich and I'm going to be powerful. Then I'm going to do good things with my riches and my power. Doesn't happen. Didn't happen with him either, because you're not the same person anymore. The path that you walked has changed you. And so God understands that. He knows that. How does God change the path that we walk? He doesn't do it with his judgment, even though there's a time of judgment coming. He does it with his love and his compassion. It grabs the heart. I had a neighbor, and I brought up a couple weeks ago, Brian was up here with Brent Tucker, and they were talking about being in Albania. And I mentioned about how some guys have gone and some work has started in Albania. And they asked a question, and I laughed because it was the same question that they heard when they were there. Why Albania? Why Albania? And so it gave me a wonderful opportunity to share with my neighbors about God's love. So what happens is, these are guys that they understand God's compassion toward them, his love toward them. Not that we are holy and righteous and we deserve. No, it was the opposite. They go to a place, and it's the same question that they were asked by the people in Albania. Why would you come here? Well, the reason is because of God's compassion toward them. And because God had been compassionate toward them, they wanted to come and share that story and that message because they believed God was also compassionate toward the people in this country. I don't know if you understand this, but most of the religions and the movements of the world, in order to gain control, work on fear and power. Should God be feared? Yes, because he can do anything he wants. Should God be feared? Yes, because you cross him and you will lose. But what you have to understand, this is how Jesus portrays God. He is a father. He cares about his kids. He cares about their heart, what they become, not what they have. I mean, he cares about what you have, but he knows what you have, you're only going to have for a short period of time. But as you go through life, how you get it and how you hang on to it and what you do with it, all of those are based on decisions that affect who you are in here. Who can change what you are in here? Only God can do that. He's the only one that can make that change, and this is the way he does it. If you're a mother, your dad, especially if you're a dad, you should understand this. This is the way you change your kid's life, by showing compassion. Have rules? Sure. Is there discipline? There has to be discipline. But your kids need to always understand the compassion that you have for them, because they understand, that's my dad. He wants the best for me. So that as they go through life, they'll realize, even though I may not like his decision, I know he wants the best for me. I believe him and I trust him. My son, when we first came to the Woodlands, he's pre-kindergarten. And as a pre-kindergarten, our very first Sunday, this works really well, right? When you're a young pastor, young guy coming, showing up, I get a message from my wife that one of the ladies, one of the older ladies came, and she's upset because the new pastor's son, she goes to my wife with this, he needed to go to the restroom, and so he went outside and used one of the bushes. That's enough explanation, isn't it? Right? So you understand. This happens to be one of the bushes in the drive where everybody drives in and out. So, yeah. And my wife loved to dress him back then. She got away with it in, I call it little Lord Fauntleroy outfits. He had on knickers, he had, but he was trying to prove, now I'm tough, and he had learned it from someone, not me. I didn't teach him that that's the way little boys go out and use the bathroom. Maybe his uncle, probably his mom. But, somebody else, had taught him to do this, and she was upset about it. She was really upset about it. In fact, she was like, he one day will be a derelict and whatever. Yeah, okay. It's not that bad yet, just, we overreact to some things they're not that big a deal. They're not that important. You want to look for the heart of your child. Where's the heart of your child going? And understand how to appeal to, how to discipline, and yet at the same time, how to lead the heart of your child. I put a couple other verses in here because I don't know if you like Proverbs. Anybody like Proverbs? I love the Proverbs, but they do wear me out sometimes, just to let you know. Proverbs are Old Testament. They're wisdom sayings. They're real pithy sayings, but a couple of them were so good that I was reading this past week that I thought I'd put them in here because they're really about kids. This is Proverbs 17, verse 24 says this, and this is from the New American Standard. These two are, so this is a really literal translation. It says this: wisdom is in the presence of the one who has understanding. You're like, what does that mean? That means if you find someone that clearly has understanding and you go and you get around them, what you will notice is in the midst of how they make their decision is true wisdom. That means not just looking at the moment, but where does this lead? Where does this take us? And then the backside of that, it says, but the eyes, because this is the way they're usually written, but the eyes of the fool are on the ends of the earth. That means the person who is foolish about the future is looking for everything in the world and missing wisdom that is just right there and that they should understand. This is also a New American Standard. It says, he who restrains his words has knowledge. You don't have to be hot and angry and loud and boisterous all the time. And he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. That's cool, isn't it? Yeah, I like that. Cool. Yeah, baby, cool. I like it. In fact, probably where the phrase comes from. That's the literal translation, that the one who has a cool spirit, yeah, be cool, Just don't overreact. It's okay. We're okay. We'll be fine. This is from the New Living Translation, a more modern one. It says, verse 28, even fools are thought to be wise when they kept silent. Hey, that's good. You even have a fool and you think they're wise because they don't say anything. And he goes on the flip side of that, with their mouths shut, they seem intelligent. Doesn't say they are intelligent, just says they seem intelligent because they don't always have to sound off about everything. And then in chapter number 18 of Proverbs 2, it says this: fools do not want to understand anything. They only want to tell others, say this with me, this is my thoughts. This is how I see it. Yeah, it's a foolish way to live because wisdom may not be just in your thoughts. You need to search out for what is wise. Here's what Paul writes to the Ephesians. He says, children, so I had to throw this in there. Sorry, guys. Children, obey your parents. Yes. He's just saying, this is wise. Children, obey your parents. They've been here longer. They've done more. They're trying to lead you. Obey your parents because you belong to the Lord. For this is the right thing to do. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment, catch this, with a promise attached to it. If you honor your father and mother, things will go well for you, and you will have a long life on the earth. That's a promise in this life that he gives for doing this. Then it goes on to say in verse number 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. That means being so hard on them. Every little thing that they do. So they just think there's no way I can please my dad. There's no way I can do something right in his eyes. That becomes the impression that they have of their father. He says, rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. When I did single adults for a long time, there was a guy, really good athlete. He's about 6'2", just really smart, really creative. He did really well in his profession. But one of the things that was so clear, we became very good friends, is he and his father did not get along. And the point of that was he only had sisters, and the father got along well with the sisters, but there was this expectation on the son. And the expectation was that he would be like his father. But he wasn't like his father. His gifts were different. His talents were different. His father, I met him, was like a tree trunk. I mean, he was stout, he was strong. This guy was 6'2", he was athletic, he was agile. I mean, he was an incredible guy. He was a star in football. It wasn't good enough for his father because he wanted him to be like him. And at some point, yes, absolutely true. At some point, he did what he did. His actions in life were guided by his hatred of his father, that his father never accepted him. And I knew him before, and then afterwards, the heart change that came as he realized, because there was one girl that stayed after him for a year and a half, and she told him over and over, she was always talking to him in the business they were in. And they made a lot of money, the business they were in, but she was always saying, one day you will need the love of God. One day you will need to understand just how much Jesus Christ loves you. And she would not judge him, she would not go after him, but she constantly said, one day you will need God's compassion and God's love. And she stayed after him, and eventually at some point he gave in. And his life changed. It radically changed. One of the hardest things he had to go through, which is why we spent so much time, was to go back eventually and forgive his father for how his father had treated him. It was really difficult. His view of the heavenly father was so radically different than his view of his earthly father. And he had to understand that his earthly father was just as flawed as he was, and that he needed compassion, just like this, my friend, needed God's compassion. Moral kids, here's number 3, moral kids, yes. You want to raise moral kids. You want your kids to know to do the right thing. You want to, yes, discipline them to do the right thing. You just want to make sure that as you do this, that you still understand that it's the heart that is important, which means truth and compassion are so key for your kids becoming who they're supposed to be. In fact, it's what will enable you with your kids to let them be who they are. They don't have to be all the same, look the same, do the same, but it gives them the freedom to be who they are, and you can love them in who that they are. Look at what he says. This is in verse number 5. He says, but because you are stubborn and you refuse to turn from your sin, in other words, you refuse to learn and to listen to who God is and see that it's God's compassion that makes these changes. He says, you're storing up terrible punishment for yourselves. He's not just talking about in the future judgment. He's talking about now, pain and punishment for yourselves because you have not learned how to do this. He said, for a day of anger is coming when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will judge everyone according to what they have. Say it with me. Yes. That means how they've lived. There's a judgment that comes from that. He will give eternal life to those who keep on doing good, seeking after glory and honor and the immortality that God offers, but he will pour out his anger and wrath on those who live for themselves, who refuse to obey the truth and instead live lives of wickedness. There will be trouble and calamity for everyone who keeps on doing what is evil, for the Jew first and also for the Gentile. Now he's setting himself up here because he's saying it's not that God will treat the Jewish people differently than the Gentile people, even though he did in the sense that he used the Jewish people to try to show who he was. But there's an impartiality with God. I will say this too, and the same thing is true whether you are, say, well, I'm Catholic, he'll treat me different. Or I'm Baptist, he will treat me different. Or I grew up Presbyterian, he will. No, God is not like that. He loves us all. That's a part of who he is. But God is impartial as far as that's concerned. And in this case, he's using the Jew and Gentile. He says in verse 10, but there will be glory and honor and peace from God for all who do. Say it with me. What? Of course. Because in the goodness that we do, it shows that we are seeking after God, we understand who He is, and we are responding to His compassion for us, His patience toward us. We're responding to the character of God, and we're imitating that character. For the Jew first, also to the Gentile, for God does not show, say it with me, He doesn't show what? In other words, no set of rules for one, and it doesn't apply to the other. It's just not the way God does it. He would not be fair if He did that. In the New Testament, it says, for God, He pours out the rain on both the righteous and that's right. He shines down the sunshine, sometimes more than we want, on both the godly and yeah, that's right. That is God's compassion toward all mankind. And those of us who understand, who know God's compassion through His Son Jesus Christ, should understand it more than anyone else, that's how the heart is changed. Number 4, finally, best kind of change comes from goodness and fairness. Of course it does. It always has come from goodness and fairness. And if you jump down to the end of this chapter, I'm skipping through a lot of it only because he goes into a lot about circumcision, uncircumcision, that you would afterwards say, what is he talking about up there? So he's just talking about the outward difference of the Jews, saying, no, but we are different, the outward difference as opposed to the Gentile. And Paul is trying to focus on the inward difference, and this is how he finishes up in 28. He says, for you are not a true Jew because you were born of Jewish parents or because you have gone through the ceremony of circumcision. No, catch this. A true Jew is one whose heart is what? It's right with God. Well, how do you get your heart right with God? You respond to God. You respond to His love, His compassion. That changes you. It breaks you. And he says, and true circumcision is not merely obeying the letter of the law. Rather, it is a change of heart produced by God's Spirit because we yield to Him. And God's Spirit is able to change us on the inside. And a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God, not from people. One last little story. When I was, this was my junior in high school, is where I went through a real change in my life. And the one thing that I remember is I came back my senior year in high school, and when I came back my senior year in high school, there were some things that I was learning how to do, and I was good at it. I decided that it was better to be quick with your tongue and quick-witted than it was to be able to physically, be powerful and strong, even though I wanted to be that also. But I knew, boy, this was even a more effective way and weapon to get what you wanted and to deal with others. So I was like that. I could be biting in my statements. I could be really quick mentally in an argument, and I used that. And I came back my senior year, and this was one of the things that so caught me off guard, but it was such an evidence for me. I didn't want to do that anymore. In fact, I didn't do that anymore. It was really hard too. I saw the setups. I trained myself, and you just have to bite your tongue and don't say that because it will humiliate someone. It will make them feel small, which was a good thing before because that makes me feel bigger. And just don't do that. And I didn't do that. And my friends thought, what is wrong with you? Something's wrong. That why would you do that? I didn't understand it at the time, but here's what I understand now. I look back, and here's what I realized. God was changing my what? My heart, yes. God was reshaping my heart. Because I wasn't just looking at it, what was the benefit to me, if I do this? Now all of a sudden I was looking at the other person and saying, yeah, but what is the damage that I do to the other person if I say this or I do this? And I couldn't do it anymore. I mean, I still do at times. I still slip up, I still going to go there, but there was a change occurring in my heart. And that's the evidence that God does something inside of us that we cannot do in ourselves. I couldn't have quit doing that. It was because of how much I understood God's love for me, His compassion for me, that all of a sudden, man, He just melted my heart, and I did things differently. There was a guy, when I worked with singles also, and if you don't know me, if you come in and tell me some amazing story of something you've been a part of, I'm a skeptic. So hopefully you're okay with that. I'm going to be like, hang on, So if you tell me you were swallowed by a whale, I know Jonah, but so anyway, there was a guy who told me, and I met with him, and he told me at some point, at the end of his bed, Jesus appeared to him. Now, just to let you know, I'm going to be a skeptic, even though I love Jesus, and I hope Jesus does speak to you. But I'm going to be a skeptic of whether or not Jesus actually appeared at the end of the bed. Actually, I knew this guy, I'd worked with this guy too, and he had a problem with drugs and alcohol. So also, in my mind, I might think, well, there may be a reason Jesus appeared at the end of the bed. So are you okay with that? Just want to make sure you're okay with that. I'm not one that somebody just tells me some wild story, I'm going to believe it, even if it sounds very Christian or whatever. That's just the way I am. Except, I knew this guy. I had watched his life, and I'd seen the change that occurred in his life. Now, again, you're saying, so now you believe it? I don't know. But what I do know is something incredible happened. Something miraculous happened to this guy, and he wasn't the same person anymore. I know that somebody says, well, you can't, if you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic, you're a drug addict, that was not true with him. He walked away, never walked back. An amazing change occurred in his life. It doesn't happen to everybody. This doesn't work that way with everybody. But it did with this guy. And his heart was different, and what he wanted to do was different, and everything on the inside changed about who he was. So because of that, and he never went around using the story and saying, I'm special because of this. The specialness of his life was the shift that occurred in his life. How God moved his heart. Listen, I say this because as a father, as a dad, you have a chance with your kids to love your kids, to be compassionate with your kids, to be kind with your kids, to not be too harsh on your kids, to not jump on everything, that your kids do, so that you can discipline and instruct and direct your kids as the person that they know, this is the person who loves me and cares about me and what happens to me, what I become more than anyone else. I don't think there's any greater privilege in life than to be that person. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you do love us, and as well as all the things that you're capable of, the power of who you are, the amazing things that you can do. Still, one of the most amazing, or maybe the most amazing, is that you alone have the power to change our hearts, to lead us in a different direction so that what we become is not what we would have become if we had not had you working and active, loving and caring for us in our lives. If you're here and you've never put your hope in Jesus Christ, maybe you've just looked at the idea of God or religion and you've thought, who needs it? Listen, this is why we need it. Because God can make a change in our lives that we cannot make. But it does take a surrender on our part. To say, Lord, I believe you. I trust you. Best I can. I know that you don't love me because I'm perfect or I do everything right or because I'm better than other people. In fact, sometimes I'm not even sure why you love me. But I'm convinced that you do. And that you have plans better than my plans. Things that you want to do inside of me. Ways that you want to use me in someone else's life. And they're wonderful things. So Lord Jesus, you can pray something like this. I give you my life. I surrender myself to you because you can do what I can't do. I know that you gave your life so that I would not carry my sins with me. I would not be controlled by all of those things, but so that you can move and shape and control my life. Thank you for that. In Jesus' name I pray.